thank you for having me tonight. Thank you for braving the weather. So the war on drugs, how's that going for you here in Houston? You happy with it? Has it reduced death, disease, crime, and drug use? These are the 4 categories of harm that were to be alleviated by the war on drugs. I represent LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. We're a non-profit international organization of current and former members of law enforcement. We're chiefs of police, sheriffs, judges, prosecutors, police officers, narcotics officers, DEA agents. All of us who believe that the current war on drugs has made those 4 categories of harm infinitely worse. You know, up until 1914, drugs were legal in America. Cocaine, heroin, amphetamines sold over the counter with companies such as Bayer. There were no drug problems, no gangs, there was no major crime associated with drug use. But the government decided that recreational drug use was too high in America. And so drugs, especially those that were sold over the counter, were made illegal. I entered law enforcement about 1971, and as a police officer for the city of San Jose, I really saw little evidence of a problem with drugs in our community. No street gangs existed. We had no drive-by shootings. Any of the other problems that are associated with drug use today. There certainly weren't any headlines in the San Jose Mercury News about large drug seizures. Alcohol was by far the cause of most of society's problems back then. But there were those who felt that drug use was too high in our country at that time. After all, President Nixon had declared the war on drugs. Not only recreational drugs, but a lot of prescription drugs. Although I didn't realize that what I was experiencing as a police officer of a major city at that time was that we did not have a war on drugs. We had a war on people. The war was beginning to be waged on a large number of our population. Almost all the arrests were for simple possession, not for being under the influence, not for committing crimes while in the influence. 1974, I was transferred to the Narcotics Division of the Detective Bureau. At this time, the U.S. government was funding massive grants to law enforcement agencies for this new war on drugs. The San Jose Police Department narcotics team was expanding from a small 5-man unit to a 15-man division within the Detective Bureau. This type of expansion was being replicated through law enforcement agencies all across the nation. Within the narcotics division, I was immediately assigned to what was called the Major Violator Team. And as one of 2 undercover officers on that team, my typical initial investigation would result in my making a couple of buys of cocaine or methamphetamine, followed up by an arrest and a search warrant. We started making headlines in the newspaper, and the district attorney would announce that a major blow had been dealt to the drug community. And of course, what would follow would be that someone would take that dealer's place. And the more we enforced the law, the more we arrested dealers, the more and the bigger the drug dealers became. Soon I was infiltrating and buying from pound quantity dealers. More arrests, more headlines, another table full of dope, guns, and money. Another pronouncement by the district attorney that another blow had been made to our community's drug network. But by now, we narcotics officers standing off to the side would look at each other and smirk. See, we knew nothing would change. We knew that someone was already maneuvering to take this dealer's place. And what we were also learning that when someone moves in to take over, it's not done with attorneys and contracts. It's done with violence and bloodshed. All of which we were beginning to experience all over San Jose. We couldn't explain the rapid rise in crime until I found out what happens when you get too successful in removing your local drug dealers from your neighborhoods. While working undercover and with informants, I discovered that San Jose was the hub of the newly formed Nuestra Familia, the first real street gang in San Jose as we know them today. They had moved into the void that we in law enforcement had created. It was also during this time that I was a student at the University of San Francisco in a master's degree program. And I had completed a study and a thesis on the impact of drug abuse on the crime index of a community. And the bottom line of that study was that 80% of all our prisoners in jail were in jail for a drug or a drug-related offense. Although I could not articulate it at the time, I began to personally question what we were doing as a nation in this war on drugs. I had a sense that the war on drugs was a war on a problem created by the war on drugs. Well, you can imagine my disappointment when I found out there was nothing new to this discovery between prohibition and property crime. Back in 1930, Albert Einstein had already commented on this connection to the rise in crime during alcohol prohibition. By 1977, I was an officer with the DEA task force in San Jose. And my investigations ranged from a federal judge who was eventually indicted and removed from office to criminal organizations which fell under the federal racketeering statutes. I infiltrated the Hells Angels, which led to the purchase of large amounts of methamphetamine. That in turn led to the seizure of methamphetamine labs. These cases, along with other investigations, led to an indictment of 36 members of the Hells Angels. With the DEA task force, there were other large cases, buys of multi-pound quantities of cocaine, heroin, warehouses full of marijuana, airplanes full of dope. Nothing was getting better. It was only getting worse. More deaths by overdose, more disease, more crime associated with drugs, more street gang violence, and more drug use.